So I have a characterized character with his control rig, and I still have that root bone that wasn't assigned to anything when defining the character. So I'm going to set up a custom control for this. I want an object that is going to drive that root control. So you could go to the asset browser and bring in a cube or a skeleton root or a marker, something that an object that you easily want to see. Personally, I prefer to use a mesh that I customized specifically for this, and this mesh is part of a template scene that I merge when I work on a character. So this is the scene with the root control mesh already in. So the cool thing with this mesh is that it's clearly pointing forward, so you can easily see the forward axis, and it's three-dimensional, so you also see if it's pointing up or down, and you easily see the orientation. So that's easier than having a bone, for example, because when you have a bone and you rotate it and you're far away, it's really hard to see. And also because it's a mesh, even if I cycle through and I hide my bones and my markers, I still see the mesh. So the root is so important when you animate for games to see the displacement, the rotation of the character, that I prefer to see it at all time. And again, because it's three-dimensional, when I come to a side view, for example, an orthographic view, I can still select it very easily. If it's a flat plane, it's harder to see and select. So I highly recommend using this type of models. And this object I already put in my all controls group by default. So the first thing you want to do is create a character extension for your character. So you can come here in the navigator and right click and say create character extension. When you do that, you have a character extension, and if you go to the properties, you see that this character extension is already assigned to your character. In my case, because I use the template scene, I already have an extension actually with that root control in it. The only thing is this extension is not assigned to any character because it was created prior to the character. So I just need to click and drag that character in. If I come and refresh, I see that now the extension is assigned to the character. So why do we want a character extension? It's because this way, every time I key in full body, my extension is part of the character. So if I key now, I see a red key because I keyed in full body. That also means that my object can be part of poses. So if I store a new pose for this character, and I then move my control around here, and in full body, I apply the pose, my character will move and snap relative to that root. So that's very crucial when you work on game animation, and it really is a must-have. And of course, you could create many more character extensions for a character for certain bones like armor, for facial. And the cool thing is when you group multiple objects in the same extension, the extension behaves like a body part. So if I have more objects here and I key in body part on that extension, it's going to add a key for that extension. So if I'm in body part and I key and I only have a key on that body part, it shows me a yellow key in my timeline. So now that we have the root control, so the model part of our character extensions, I'm actually going to parent that root control to my reference node here, next to the other controls. Because this object is part of the controllers, right? It's what I'm going to animate. It's not the bones that I'm going to export. Now if I look at the bones, when I move the root control around, the root bone doesn't follow yet. So I need to create a constraint to constrain the bone to the model. In the template scene that I merged, I already have those constraints, but otherwise you can create those manually by creating a parent-child constraint and maybe call it root bone to control. So that's the bone being constrained to the controller, and you want the opposite constraint. You want the control being parented to the bone. Okay, so for me, I already have those constraints here. in my don't touch folder. So those are the constraints that the animator shouldn't have to worry about. And in the driven constraints, I have those two parent constraints here, bone to control and control to bone. So I just have the root control assigned. I need to assign the root bone. So really the base of my skeletal hierarchy. Hold X and drag. So in one constraint, the bone is the child and the controller is the parent. And in the other constraint, the controller is the child and the root bone is the parent. So I have the two opposite constraints. And then I just need to activate it. To activate them, you want to snap. Why? It's because the root bone usually has a rotation, a 90 degrees rotation if you import it from a Z-up scene from Maya, and you want to conserve that offset. So just to be safe, see here in global mode, I have a minus 90 rotation on my root. So I want to snap and then lock. Very important to always lock your parent-child constraint. I'm going to do the same on the other constraint. Snap and then lock. So here we did it just for the root control, and we just have like one constraint for the bone following the control and one constraint for the control following the bone. And we did that because we have some offsets here between the root and the bone, right? There's a 90 degree offset because of a Y-up, Z-up conversion between Maya and MotionBuilder, right? So if I select my root bone in a local space, I see that I'm in Z-up and Y is pointing backward. And if I select my roots, I have Y pointing up and Z pointing forward. So that's why I prefer to use a parent-child constraint for the root. Now, I created another constraint that I call the import relation. It's also in the don't touch folder because, again, animators shouldn't have to worry about it. And this import relation constraint is a little setup to switch around the two constraints. So on your root control, you want to go to the properties, editor. And in the editor, you go to custom properties. Now select your root object and you can add a boolean. So boolean is going to be a checkbox. It's either true or false, 1 or 0. I'm going to call it my boolean. Now you can close it. Now I can create a relation constraint. I'm going to call it import demo. And I can select my root, hold X and drag it in here and set it as a sender. So it's going to send the information. Now in the list, I see every animatable property of my root. So I see rotation, scale, translation, and a couple other custom properties that I already set up. But I don't see the my boolean property that I created because it's not animatable yet. So that value cannot change over time right now. So I need to set it to animatable. Now it appears in the list. So I can work with it. I'm just going to lock the property now to make sure I don't accidentally key it because it's not something that I'm going to key all the time. It's just an option on the rig that I either activate or deactivate. So I'm going to lock it. But even though it's locked, I can still work with it in the relation, which is great. Now I want to take the two constraints that I have, so the root constraint to the control and the control constraint to the root bone. And those both have their weights animatable. I'm going to take the two constraints that I have for my root, so the bone following the control and the control following the root. I want to make sure they both have their weight set to animatable and go to the import relation constraint and drag them in as receiver this time because we want to drive the weight of those constraints based on the Boolean option we just created. So they're both receivers now. And here you have a series of nodes that you can use in the relation constraint. So when this option is on, I want the control to bone constraint to have a weight of 100% and the other constraint to be 0%. And when the option is off, I want the opposite. So I'm going to select that node here. If condition, then A, else B. So I have this node, and in this node I can plug a bool condition. So I'm going to use my boolean. So that means that if that boolean is true, the node is going to output the A number that I have here. And if the condition is false, it's going to output the B number. And I can right click on those arrows and set a value. And I can set it to 100%, right click, set value, and 0%. And I can plug that into the first constraint. Now I'm just going to copy paste that node and do the opposite. If condition A is going to be 0, and otherwise B is going to be 100%. And I'm going to plug that in my other constraint. And if you want to debug, you can right click, show all values. So right now, the my boolean condition is at 0. So the first node outputs 0%, and the second node outputs 100%. So right now, because I'm not in import mode, I'm not importing any animation, I am animating, I'm editing the animation, my control drives the bone. If I go on the controller, and maybe I unlock this temporarily, and I set the option to true, now my values switched around because my condition is now set to 1. So the outputs are reversed, and the bone is controlling the control. So the last step is just to control this option directly from my master relation. So I'm going to lock it again, lock selected property, and I'm going to reduce all the folders, drive the import demo into the don't touch folder so I forget about it. And here in the master relation, I just need to come on the my boolean and say right click, set value. So now the animator is free to switch the option on and off as they want. So the cool thing with that is that they just have to tick one box. They don't need to go into the don't touch folder, look for the two constraints and then activate one and deactivate the other, or activate the other and activate the first one. So it's much faster. Just keep them active at all time, have the weight be either 0 or 100%, and just have one box to check. And also the cool thing is, because it's on a relation constraint that's always active, when I activate this option, the option is true on every take that I have in the scene. So if I import multiple animations at the same time, I can apply this option on all of them, bake all my animations, and this way import all my animations all at once. And if you have a lot more controllers than that, for example, here I have some pants and butt bones that I want to animate. If you want to create controls for these, you can, create a new marker, maybe parent it to the corresponding controls. So here I'm going to parent those to the FK effector. Create a second one, parent, and those pen bones here, they are parented to the thigh, so I'm going to create a couple more, parent to the thigh. So I'm kind of recreating the same hierarchy. So that's what I would do for armors, for facial bones, for cloth, anything you need to animate that's outside the main body. I'm gonna align those cubes to the original bones. And maybe I'm gonna change the look of those markers. And I'm going to add those in character extensions. So on my character, I'm going to right click, create character extension, maybe have a player extension butt. So those are deformers for the muscle deformers for the butt. You could have that for bicep, for shoulder, whatever. And I have some for the pants. So I'm going to create another extension, player extension pants. And because I have left and right for the pant, I prefer to do separate extensions, because one is parented to the left thigh and the other one is parented to the right thigh. Pant right. And I'm going to select those controls and drag and drop them into the extensions. And when I do so, they become semi-transparent, so that confirms that they are part of my character. So it's a nice way to debug. So I'm going to drag to pant left and pant right. Okay, became semi-transparent. And on those extensions, what I can do is select a reference object. This is pretty important when applying poses in body part, because it's going to make sure it applies the pose relative to the proper object. So in this case, I'm going to select the pelvis and drag and drop it here. So for the butt, because my butt bones are originally parented to the pelvis, I assign the pelvis as the reference object of my butt extension. Then for the pants left, I can lock the window and select the left thigh and use that as my reference object. And I'm going to select the right thigh for the other extension. So now I have controls that are part of my character. So it's similar to what we've done with the root control originally. So if I key, they will be part of my control. If you don't like seeing the parent link like this, you can always remove that. Here, show parent link. Oh, of course, I need to rename those guys. Pant left. Pant right. And I want to make sure they are in my all controls group here. And on my controls, I will add the namespace. Add namespace. I'm going to add the player control namespace. Last thing we need to do is link the bones to the controls and link the controls to the bones, so that when we import FBX data, we can, reverse the constraint and basically do the same setup as the root. But because here already we have 4 controls, I don't want to create 2 constraints for each of these controls. I will end up with 8 constraints already, and if I have more controls, I will end up with a large number of constraints, and this is going to become a nightmare. So instead of using a parent constraint for those controls, I'm actually going to use a relation constraint. So I have a relation constraint that I call bone to control, and I have a relation constraint that I call control to bones. So in the bone to control constraints, I'm going to select all my controls here. So the constraint bone to controls means that the bones are constraints to the controllers. So that means that my controllers should be the senders. And in my bone to control relation constraints, the bone should be following the controllers. That means that the controllers are the parents. They are the masters. So here I'm going to assign them as senders. In the other constraint, the control should be the receivers, the slaves, because they will be following the bones. So I'm going to set them as receivers. Okay, then I'm going to select the bones in the same order. And I'm going to drag them here, and this time I'm going to do the other way around. So here they're going to be senders, and in the other constraint they're going to be receivers. Okay, and now because I selected them in the same order in the viewport, they are aligned in front of each other. So my butt R control is in front of the butt R bone, etc. So I can just assign the rotation and translation. If you need to scale those bones, of course, you can also assign, you can also link the scaling. So that's a little tedious to set up, I know, especially if you have like dozens of controls. Technically, you could also assign the bones to character extensions and directly animate the bones if that's easier for you, if those are bones that you're only going to animate a couple of times. It's up to you, but usually it's better to have actual controls that are part of the FK effector hierarchy, so it's a little bit cleaner, and you really have a separation between the controls and the skeletons. And finally, so those two relation constraints, we also want to make sure the weight is animatable. So the A is gray here. We can go to our import relation constraint and drag and drop them as receivers. So you can put a relation constraint inside another relation constraint. And I just have to plug them on the same condition multipliers that I had, 100% 0 or 0 100%. So bone to control and control to bone. So again, I just have parent constraints, like two parent constraints for the root, and for all the other bones, because I don't have any offset between my control and my bones, I just have a common relation constraint where maybe you're going to end up with lots of controls and bones, and those are also driven, the weight is also driven by one and only one import constraint here. And just to check that it works, if I come to my master relation, when my boolean is off, my controls are driving the bones, and when the boolean is on, I can't move the controls anymore, but now the bones are driving. And when I bake from skeleton to control rig, everything like the controls will be baked as well. So this is how you set up root control and an import mode for animators to use. And again, if you use the template scene that I link below, you don't have to set up that import relation constraint. It's already set up for you here. You just have to fill in the driven constraints, just have to fill in your root bone here, here, and if you have extra controls, you just need to set them up as sender and receivers in the relation bone to control and the relation control to bone, reversely. And to go a little bit deeper into the options that you have in the template scene, I have a root bake option. So this root bake option is to have the root under the pelvis and the spine. Usually I assign the pelvis and the chest as two parents, and I zero that out. And this constraint is also driven by an option in the master relation. So in the master relation, if the animator come in and select temp root bake, my root is now following kind of like the center of mass. So if I lean the character, it moves a little, and if I move the character around, it follows. So that's if the animator wants to temporarily bake the root bone under the character, for example during a long mocap take, instead of animating the root by hand. So that's the option here, temp root bake. So you just need to fill in and add some parents here. The other option is hips auxiliary effector bake. So what is that? Usually I create an auxiliary effector here on the pelvis, and auxiliary effectors are IK effectors that are going to drive your character, and the cool thing is you can parent those to something else. So in my case, I parent the hips IK effector to my root control. Parent. Okay, so now if I move the control around, my pelvis is following. I can change maybe the look of that effector to a hard cross, so that I can select both the hips effector and the auxiliary effector. Okay, and what I want is I want the effector to drive the hips only when this option is active. So when the option is not active, I just have to constrain the auxiliary effector to the IK effector and activate the constraint with 0 offset. So click 0. Okay, and you can leave the IK blend to 100%. So now by default, the auxiliary effector is always following my main effector that I animate with, and the root is independent. And if I activate the option, hips root space, and I turn off the IK blend translation and rotation of the IK effector, now I can move around this and the hips are following. So I basically have a toggle to activate and deactivate the hips in root space. So this is nice if you want to clean up a run cycle that's moving forward and you want to see the coordinate of the hips relative to the root, for instance. The only thing you want to do is make sure you add that auxiliary effector to the character extensions. That's not automatic. And because that effector is relative to the root, instead of creating a new extension, I'm just going to add that effector to my root effector that I have already created here, which contains my root control. And make sure my player character is assigned here. Player. Okay, and the last option I want to show is character scale. It's another custom property I added on my character. And what this thing does is an option to scale up the entire character. So by default it's at 1, and in the base relation you just need to assign a couple things. So I have the root here driving a lot of options, and I have a scale number to vector. So just have one uniform scaling for the 3 axes, and here you just need to add 2 receivers. So select your player reference node, put it as a receiver, and do the same with the skeleton, put it as a receiver, and drive the scaling. So now just have one option that can scale the character up or down. So if you have a character that's scaled up in the game engine, you can scale your rig very easily by changing that option, and this way you can animate in scale. Make sure you have the root control parented to the reference control here, so that the root also gets scaled up or down. As a bonus, there's the limb roll fix relation. This one is not an option in the master relation because it was a little bit buggy. So I put it in a temp folder for animators to toggle on and off. And this is to fix the wide rotation on the limbs. If the animator animated like this, and you want to fix that your rotation, and you only want to keep the pitch. So you just need to select the forearm left and right, and the calf left and right, and first assign them as senders, and assign them again as receivers. Make sure they are all in front of each other, so I have right forearm in front of right forearm, have left forearm in front of left forearm, and so on, and just assign the rotation every time on the input and on the output. And you want to make sure that both the receivers and the senders are in right-click local transforms. Very important in this case. So now when I activate the limb rolls, it fixes the rotation, and it sets the X and Y rotation to 0. So to summarize, when you use the template scene, you have the master relation constraint, which is just options that the animators are going to use to toggle on and off some options. And when they activate those options, in the don't touch folder that activates certain options here on the root control node, that is a sender, and those options are going to drive certain constraints here. So there's a first relation that happens here. And as those constraints get a new weight of 0 or 100%, that means they get activated here in the driven constraints folder. So as a technical animator, if you set up a scene for someone else, you just need to populate those relation constraints and those parent constraints with the corresponding objects from your scene. So in the base relation, you first have the character scale. You need to put the reference node of your character and the skeleton as receivers, and plug the scaling. Okay. Then in the driven constraints, in the bone to control parent constraint, you need to add the root as a child. Say snap and lock. In the root control to bone, you want to add the root as a parent, snap and lock. In the relation bone to control and in the relation control to bone, you may want to add any extra bones like armors or anything like that. In the root bake position, you want to add the pelvis as a parent, and maybe the chest if you want the root to be more like under the center of mass rather than right under the pelvis. Say 0, lock. And in this one, root bake position, you just want to make sure in the constraint axis that you have affect Y deactivated, right? Otherwise the root bone will be flying up. In the hips auxiliary effector, you want to create a new auxiliary effector for the pelvis, parent it to the root control, change the look so it's easier to select. Maybe change that to a hard cross, maybe a little bigger. Add it to the root character extension. And add the auxiliary effector as the child and the IK effector, so the red sphere, as the parent. And say 0